For 3 days, early this month, leaders from African countries, as well as thought leaders, they met here in Nairobi to deliberate on the course of action to deal with climate change, which is impacting the continent severely. And at the end of the conversation, a document dubbed the Nairobi Declaration was crafted. It's a 65-point document, and on this show we're going to look at those critical documents and of course highlight some of the areas that we feel needs critical attention. You're watching the Base Check. We are live from Broadcasting House. My name is O'Brien Kimani, and later on we shall be looking at the state of our economy, from high fuel prices to inflation, and of course to the global geopolitics. What is affecting the Kenyan economy severely? That is a conversation that we shall be having here. But before then, remember, we have our reporters on the ground. They are tracking what's happening, and of course we shall be having some links just to get a feel of the items that we are following up today. We are live from Broadcasting House. My name is O'Brien Kimani. At O'Brien Kimani is my Twitter handle. And we have Charles Mwangi. He's the head of programs at the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. He's joining us this morning. He was part of the conversation at the African Climate Summit at Kenyatta International Convention Center. He has participated in many other forums around the world on climate change. And so when he speaks, you definitely know he's an authority on matters climate change. He's going to guide us in this conversation. He's going to share his experience at the conference, the hits and the misses, and of course, the way forward. And also remember, world leaders are meeting in New York for the annual United Nations General Assembly meeting. Of course, yesterday there was a bit of firework pitting the Russian Federation against the Ukrainian government. And we'll be telling you what exactly transpired there and why call for a ceasefire in that region is growing. Well, let's now get into the conversation. Today, we just want to track the Nairobi Declaration, climate change declaration, and of course, the call to action. Charles Mwangi, as I told you, is the head of programs at Pan-African Climate Justice. Is joining us this morning to help us in this conversation. Charles, thank you so very much indeed for your time. I first of all want to hear from you. I mean, you were there. You witnessed, you saw what happened within those 3 days. I want to hear, what was your thought about the climate summit?
Thank you so much, O'Brien, and I'm happy to come back again. I want to begin by mentioning that the summit in itself was a good thing. In fact, the decision by the African heads of state to actually host this particular summit in itself was a good idea. Mm-hmm. And it's an idea that should have come much, much earlier, because we have always said that it's important for the African, continent, for the African continent to speak as one, to speak in one voice. Yep. Because matters and issues that are affecting us, particularly on climate change, really are homogeneous across the continent. Mm-hmm. And therefore, we need to come up with a position, an African position, really on how we need to take this discourse and conversation around climate change. So that was a good thing, and we were privileged as Kenya to host this summit, pretty much because our president really has been the chair of the African Union Heads of State Committee, on climate change. Mm-hmm. So we got that opportunity, and the good thing is that there's a decision now, or a commitment by the African leaders to make this summit a biannual event. Yes. So that this is not an end in itself, but it's just but the beginning, so that we can be able to have several other events, going forward. Mm-hmm. And maybe just to also mention that, of course, we had our own concerns around this summit. Of course, being the inaugural summit, we expected there could be a few issues here and there. We raised those issues as non-state actors, and we really felt that this needed to be a very, very inclusive process, where all stakeholders are involved, including especially the communities at the front line of climate crisis. Mm-hmm. And I'm talking of the indigenous people. I'm talking of communities living in marginalized, regions, the arid and semi-arid regions. Mm-hmm. I'm talking of the women constituency, religious community, farmers, and so on and so forth. And of course, we did engage the organizers of this particular summit. At the end of the day, that inclusion really was achieved. We were able to have all these constituencies on the table and to contribute, to the conversation around matters climate change in Africa.
Very well, and I want now to hear from you. I mean, even before the conference kicked off, I mean, there were concerns by non-state actors that there was no proper consultation, and they were calling for more consultations to ensure that the interest of all Africans, is captured in that conference. Was that factored?
Yeah, when a decision was arrived at that we needed to have this summit, and it was agreed that this would happen in Nairobi in September, as non-state actors, we formed a committee that we were calling at the time the non-state actors steering committee. And the reason as to why that committee was formed is so that we can also be able to give our technical expertise in informing this process. Because even though this was a government or member states, an AU, kind of a process, but we felt it needed, to reflect the needs of the African people. And we felt we needed to guard that jealousy so that we are able to get an output that really speaks to the felt needs of the community. So we engaged the government officials and the organizers, including the African Union, in many fronts. And at the end of the day, at least, we were heard to quite some extent, so that our voices was heard. We had representation even in the opening, session of that particular summit, and the issues that we raised, some of them were captured, some of them were not, and I think we are going to unpack probably some of the issues that we felt were adequately addressed, but we also look at those ones that we felt probably would have done better in terms of really putting them to...
And that's where I want us to start. Let's first of all look at the issues that you feel were adequately addressed and captured during that meeting. How do you rank them?
One, I would say, the unity of the African people, the African government, is perhaps one of the biggest things we probably achieved within this particular summit. At least, we saw our leaders, at the very high level, the presidents, coming together to discuss the climate change agenda and not any other agenda. And one thing that we also probably managed to achieve within the conference is to ensure that we raise the profile of this climate change discourse from it just being an environmental issue, the way people have always perceived it. And we have been able to show that it's actually a developmental issue. And therefore, you realize most of the issues that were being conversed and discussed within that particular summit were developmental issues. But we're also very, very careful, to avoid a situation whereby this would be turned into a business summit. We needed to look at the critical issues affecting the common frontline communities and ensure that we have procedures, and we have come up with at least with some recommendations in terms of how we move forward. At least the declaration is there, but one thing that is lacking is a mechanism, to ensure that we are able to make a proper follow-up, of the recommendations. We needed to see our leaders being more assertive in terms of this is the roadmap we are going to use, in order for us to be able to achieve, the aspirations of our people, as stipulated within the 65, point document.
You are raising something that a lot of people are also raising, that then how do we make the Nairobi Declaration not to be just another document drafted after meetings of big cuts, and how do we then ensure that this document is alive and it is worked on, and so that is still now the big question. And how would you propose this to happen?
Well, like I did mention, we have had many conferences, including what we call the Conference of Parties, and now we have the 28th conference happening in Dubai in the next few months. And one of the problems is that we always get a lot of commitments in most of these particular meetings, and very good speeches. But beyond that, we don't see those actions, actually being implemented. Those good recommendations, those good points that are raised, we don't see, sometimes implementation of the same. And that is our biggest fear, with this particular declaration. We have a declaration. We have read it out. Our president is actually at UNGA, United Nations General Assembly, in New York, and he's already articulating some of the issues and outputs of this particular document. But how can we be able to come together and really come up with a clear action plan that this is the roadmap we are going to follow? There are several things that were good in that particular document. One of them, of course, the declaration recognized and quoted actually the IPCC, the Governmental Panel on Climate Change, 6th assessment report, which clearly indicates that Africa really is warming, beyond or faster than other regions in the world, and that Africa, of course, is experiencing the most impacts of adverse impacts of climate change, and that we need to, of course, act very quickly. And it indicated, actually called upon the developed country partners to honor their commitments, particularly making reference to the $100 billion, dollar commitment per year, which was done about 14 years ago, and where we have not even seen, the products of the same. They recognize, of course, the issue of frozen damage, and that we need to really focus on how we address that particular question and how, of course, we fund, that particular facility. There was a call, of course, to also ensure that we are reducing, of course, consumption of fossil fuels, but also phasing out, or phasing down, coal. Although we felt that probably that could have been much stronger, so that we talk about phasing out and not just phasing down, that the energy like coal. Some of those issues are good, and of course the issue of reforming, especially the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, and how, of course, they address the whole question of availing resources, for development in Africa. I think that was a good thing, although it was not clear exactly the roadmap we are going to use in terms of ensuring that actually these MDBs, follow suit and they're able to really address some of those particular challenges. The question of debt was a big issue. That was seriously, discussed. And I know the president was talking about, a new, finance sort of architecture, that is favorable for Africa. Because the continent, of course, has been borrowing, at a very, very high interest rate, to the extent that we are borrowing at an interest rate that does not necessarily align with our growth. You realize we are probably growing at a certain particular percentage, probably 5%, 4%, and then you end up taking a loan that you're paying about 8%. So how do you expect, to make the estimate, for example? So the question of, debt restructuring, for example, the question of the issues of how countries can be given proper debt relief and so on and so forth are critical issues that would actually make a lot of sense, to the continent. Because remember, we have been saying that the African governments have already been spending on adaptation. In fact, our investment in adaptation, knowingly or otherwise, is actually 5 times more, really, than our budget for health, for example, in the continent of Africa. Meaning we are paying for adaptation through our health. In other words, the kind of debts the African governments are already in makes it very difficult for us to be able to address climate change, because it doesn't leave us with disposable income that we cannot be able to invest in terms of addressing some of the challenges that are being experienced. Right now, we are staring at El Nino, which is coming. How resilient our transport systems, for example. How resilient, our sewerage systems, can they be able to withstand probably the impacts of, El Nino, so on and so forth. And we have resources, to invest in that. So when you're talking about countries that are seriously in debt and countries that are continually being bombarded by adverse impacts of climate change, you realize that there is a great need to really reform how we finance development, in the continent of Africa. But there were some issues that we felt that were not necessarily very well articulated. And one of them, of course, is the question of adaptation. We have been very, very, very clear that adaptation remains a top priority for Africa. In fact, if you look globally, and if you look at what we call the adaptation gap report, it indicates that the gap that we have for adaptation is actually $340 billion per year up to 2030. Now that is massive.
$340 billion.
That's it globally. And in Africa, it's actually more than $80 billion, what we actually need. But the total, of course, climate finance that we need in Africa by 2030 per year is about $277 billion. So there's a huge gap. Right now, we are only discussing about doubling of adaptation finance from 20 billion to 40 billion by 2025. So that's a big joke. And I think we need to be more decisive and more focused, especially from Africa. And we come up with clear position that Africa needs adaptation perhaps much more than mitigation. And that we need to see much more focus, a global focus on adaptation, so that then we're able to build the resilience of our people, so that they can be able to withstand, the shocks that comes with the adverse impacts of climate change. So we did not necessarily have to appear like we are exonerating, the emitters and giving them, a free ticket to continue emitting by saying that we have a common, obligation to address climate change, which is true. But the thing is, they must still remain responsible, for addressing this climate, challenge, especially in terms of financing and availing the resources that are needed. Because it's clear, and it's now common knowledge, that Africa contributes the least to the emissions, but we are suffering most. And therefore, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities must stand. And therefore, even as we think about doing business in the climate change space, it must not, go against that particular principle, that whoever has done more in terms of the emissions must therefore contribute more in terms of addressing the climate change challenge. So that is one of the areas that we feel that was not very well addressed. Just transition is a critical topic.
And even before we move to just transition, and I like the fact that you are quoting, the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which, and the conversation, and that report, came out prominently during the conversation. And one of the issues that was highlighted and was captured in the Nairobi Declaration was the fact that the world is, of course, off track in achieving the 1.5% climate change degrees Celsius on climate change, and there's a call to do more to ensure that this is achieved, and the African leaders, are very categorical that the developed economies, they need to do more to reduce their green gas emission, which is hitting the ozone layer. Beyond that, what else can they do apart from raising that concern?
Well, I want to give an analogy, Brian. If you have a pipe that is leaking, and you're only concentrating in wiping the water on the floor, you might continue doing that until Jesus comes back. As you continue wiping the water...
It's a zero-sum game.
Exactly. So you must think about rectifying, whatever is happening within that particular pipe. You have to actually repair that particular pipe. And that is really an issue that is very, very, very urgent. Because even as we continue supporting Africa to adapt and other regions to adapt, mitigation remains a big, 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 big issue. But mitigation makes a lot of sense where the emissions are coming from. 96% of the emissions are coming from the developed world, the developed economies. Although we have also been saying that they also have the financial muscle to address this particular challenge. And statistics has it, data has it, that we need to reduce our emissions actually by 43% by 2030. That is about
world.
7 years. If we are to maintain the 1.5 degree target, we don't want to hit beyond 1.5 because of the impacts. You can imagine now we're at 1.1, but the impacts are already, being felt everywhere. So if we go beyond that 1.5, scientists are telling us that for sure, we are probably going to stay at a situation where we have climate change that is irreversible. Now you can imagine where we'll be headed. But now, this 43%, even if Africa cuts the emissions 100%, which is about 4%, we can only account for a very small percentage. So we need to see more ambitious NDCs, nationally determined contributions, from the high emitters. As it stands now, Africa has NDCs. In fact, the revised NDCs are so way ambitious compared to what is in the north. So we are getting to see more ambition where we probably should not be seeing that ambition, and we are seeing less of that, a commitment from where that should happen. And therefore the call by the African leaders, because it's clear on that declaration that they are calling the developed country partners to actually come up with methodologies and clear plans on how to reduce the emissions significantly. Because even if we continue doing whatever we are doing, until we address that leakage, until we address that particular source of these emissions, we'll not be doing much. But unfortunately, in the conversations at COP, that has not been forthcoming. And we don't see that commitment. And that remains a big, big, big issue because that is a game changer. Reducing emissions from where they're coming from significantly, that would actually save the world.
And one of the issues that was floated is the fact that, when you look at the African continent, it holds some of the world's largest sources of renewable energy. You're talking about sun, you're talking about wind, you're talking about hydro power. And when you look at the investment in renewable energies in Africa, it's about $60 billion US, out of the more than $3 trillion US invested in green energy. And so there was a call that we need to deepen this. But do we have strategies on how this can be deepened? This investment can be deepened? Because it is one issue to have the renewable energy sources, but it's also another issue tapping investment to renewable energy sources.
That's a very good question, and of course we take pride in the fact that we have all these natural resources. You know, like you mentioned, solar. We have sometimes 12, sometimes even more than 12, hours of sunshine, which is different from the north. We have not even exploited 10% of our geothermal potential, for example, in Kenya. We could argue Kenya is doing very well, of course, in terms of investment in renewable energy and clean energy sources, which is a good thing, but we're only scratching the surface. And remember, if you look at the African continent, actually about half of the population has got no access to energy, whether it's dirty or clean energy. We don't have that access. 600 million people are actually in darkness.
Out of the 1.2 billion.
Out of the 1.2 billion. So that's about half, of our population.
Very well.
They don't even have access to this particular energy.
Mangi, I want you to hold your thoughts on that because that information, is baffling. I mean, for a continent this big and with so much resources. I mean, the question, that information is baffling. Because we just now want to go to the Kenya School of Government, where the Chief of Staff and the Head of Public Service is currently meeting, or having a consultative meeting with ministries, departments and government agencies. Let's first of all listen in to the Head of Public Service, Felix Koskei, who is on the podium.
That he has given 3 options. So, I don't want that to overemphasize. Tinga imeanza. Na mumeona imeanza. Si imeanza, itashaga watu. Ikikupata ikikushaga, don't blame anybody. Imeanza. Unasikia sasa fulani amefanya nini, fulani amefanya nini, wengine wako motoni, wengine rid of the perpetrators. But before that, we are saying, let us be reasonable human beings and be satisfied with what we are doing and what we are getting. And this corruption is everywhere. It's everywhere. Everybody is being enticed. So a few months ago, or 1 month ago, somebody came and told me, but I hope nimefanya kazi, sasa iko project moja mbili nimekupangia, sasa wewe lete mtu. So I told him project ya nini, akasema sasa yuko na watu wengi wanasumbua wewe hapa, sasa namna hii. Are you hearing me at the back? Uko mwisho. Very good. So I told him, my friend, who told you I want a job? I want a contract. Who told you? He said, no, inafanywango hivi. I told him, get out and I will arrest you if you stay for another 5 minutes here. So, I don't want to overemphasize issues, corruption. I mean, it is within our, we know it. I think we have sung enough. And we are now deploying the agencies now to do their job. The directions with PPRA, the directions with DCI, the directions have been given to EACC to exercise their independent mandate properly, Auditor General, internal audit, in Treasury, Inspector General of state corporations, and also external support is coming. I was with development partners group anti-corruption. They are willing, so we are closing. So I've put their foot forward. They are closing in. So you maneno tuache. So we are going to pursue anybody anybody who deals with these things, kupambana nao. Secondly, around corruption is that how do you really feel when you're getting a lot of challenges in delivery of service? Because you may be practicing corruption on your corner, you need services from another institution. How do you feel when you are paying 5,000, 10,000, and you know for sure this guy is being paid a salary to deliver this service? How do you feel? Or is it normal? Have we made it that our culture, our tradition? So that one is a closed chapter. And therefore, I wanted only to mention those 3-4 items before the presentation has started. Can we be professionals? Can we attempt even to be professionals? And the question I'm asking is, why should somebody, for example, have 200 leave days that he has not taken? For example, why? What's the problem? You get people, if they are told to go and leave now, they'll go for 2 years. Others will go for 6 months. Others will go for 4 months. Why are you sticking in that office? His Excellency the President goes on leave. The Deputy President goes on leave. The Prime Cabinet Secretary goes on leave. We go on leave. What is it that you don't want anything to happen in your office? So we have decided, ladies and gentlemen, and take note, that by the end of this financial year, by 30th June 2024, the only number of leave days carried forward are 15. They are only 15. Secondly, there is no commutation of your leave days into money. Zero. So start going on leave from today. If you want to go for 2 years, go. If it is 6 months, go. If it is 1 month, go. There is no commutation. You can't commute your days into money. We cannot pay for corruption. We cannot pay for inefficiency. We cannot pay for somebody who wants to lord over others forever. Give others a breathing space also. Give others to let us mentor others to take over from us by giving them, bring them up, giving them a chance to even act for even 20 days. And by so doing, you will be seeing those people who are capable, and tomorrow, when you are exiting, you can say, yes, I brought people up, and I have so and so who are capable to run this department. So, principal secretaries, chairmen, when you reach home tonight, please go and call for all the leave balances and let everybody give a plan. By 30th June that person will have only 15 days. So agree. But those who have more than, we have now about 9 months. Those who are to go for 1.5 years, let them go. Yeah, go. There are people who have not gone for 250 days, 362 days. I don't know, I found the other day. Go. So today, tomorrow. So Wanjiku issue a circular tomorrow. The circular will be out tomorrow. What to end the leave? Let them go and rest. Let them go and harvest maize. Let them go and fish. Take your children for holiday. And then come back when you are fresh and ready to perform. These are indicators of corruption. You know? What are you keeping around there? Yes, so I want to also thank you very much, Chairman of State Corporations and CEOs. We've been receiving very positive feedback from majority of the institutions that now the two offices are working well. Majority, largely majority. There are some few people. So please, you know yourself. You just go and separate the roles. We know you, some few. There are not many, but a few. Either the chairman are still running as CEOs, the offices, still doing what I had stated the other time, that if you look at the call logs, you see they talk to the head of procurement more than even the CEO himself. Summoning procurement, summoning marketing, summoning. What are these people coming to do in your office? And yet you have one employee, that is a CEO. Unless there's some kind of interview, which I know, it has to be at least 3 people. So, Chairman, we have senior members of the society here who are chairman, who can help you to understand that they say what? They say at the board level, your hands should be off, but your nose should be in. So nusa lakini panapeleka mikono tani utachomeka mwenyewe. So let us be, and let us not be harassing the executives. It is not good. If somebody is not performing, you pass a resolution, you fire him, hire another one. There is no need to have some vicious war, and yet you are, as the board, you have powers if you have evidence to take action. So we don't want institutions to suffer. Take charge as the board. CEOs, as I told you, disclose all the material information to the board for them to make informed decisions. CEOs, you know, the boards are your employer. So, you don't have to talk down to your employer or despise your employer or keep on reminding him his role. He knows because he hired you. So the board, please take charge of your responsibility. CEOs, take charge of your day-to-day running of the institution. There are few, there are not many. Finally, I want to remind all of us that we are here for a season. The life expectancy in Kenya is how many years, Arwasa? It has increased from 50 to 68. So we are here for a season. In the boards, maximum is 2 terms. As a CEO, 2 terms. We have also said there is no third term in CEOs. 2 terms, if you can't do anything, just go do something else. We are here for a season. Why don't we put our best foot forward and contribute to the development of this country? If you look back and see that seat that you are sitting on, many people, I want you to go back and count. Go back and count. Go back and count. You'll be surprised that you can get 40, 30, 25. Mine is 10. I'm number 10. Since independence, I'm number 10. So people have passed through that office. Even yours, people have passed through it. You are not special. All what you have is to thank God that you have an opportunity to contribute to make this country better. I think that's all. There is nothing that we can be, carry around our pride. Because you are a CEO, you are a PS, or you are chairman, you are chairman of audit. No. Let us do our best to contribute the way we are, and to contribute in a positive way is to be a team player, a person who listens, a person who advises, a person who guides your juniors, and a person who wants the best for everybody in the institution that you are. So for those few remarks, I'll have another session at around where perhaps you will now expect what you are expecting a speech. I might read that speech that time. I want to take this opportunity, first of all, to thank you for turning up in very large numbers, and apologies for the problem of the jam. Even me, I was stuck for 45 minutes. I was to be here at around 8:30. I got stuck also. Apologies. Next time we shall make sure that we sit down and plan with the traffic police so that we make sure that we get an exit route for vehicles that are passing. Thank you very much for coming. I want us to listen. Zero fault audit is what we need to look at this time round. I almost forgot. There is the last thing that we are coming up with. We are coming up with, we want to reward officers that shows of outstanding performance in government institutions, like even private sector. So we want also to do it. So we'll be having stellar awards, I think, from this year, where there are parameters we are going to look at in parastatals, in ministries, and His Excellency the President will be the one to decorate the person who has performed better than the others, so that it can be an example of establishing a tradition that we have to reward the best, reprimand, and punish those who are going the other way. So for those few remarks, let me take this opportunity to now declare this meeting officially open. Thank you very much.
That is the head of public service, Felix Kosgei, there addressing members of let me get this right. It is a consultative meeting with ministries, departments and state agencies being addressed by the head of public service. It's taking place at the School of Government in Kabete. We have a reporter on the ground, and of course, in due course, we shall be, they shall be filing an appropriate report in regard to that meeting. Well, these are some of the issues that we are tracking. And of course, now we're back in studio. Our conversation this morning is on the African Climate Summit that birthed the Nairobi Declaration on Climate Change and Action and Call to Action. We are in the company of Charles Mwangi, who is the head of programs at the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. He's helping us to break down the Nairobi Declaration, the hit and the misses. Well, before we went for that briefing there by the head of public service, we were talking about some of the issues that were highlighted, and one of them you talked about the fact that in a continent whereby you have 1.2 billion people, 600 million or half of those people, they do not have access to electricity. And when you look at investment in renewable energy, you're talking about $63 billion in a continent where you have about 54 countries, and this is in comparison to the $3 trillion worth of investment in renewable energy. And so the question is then, how then Africa can raise its voice, and not just its voice, but also to ensure that there are concrete actions to increase investment in renewable energy in Africa?
Thank you so much, Brian. And energy is a very, very important element in redeeming this continent from the climate crisis we are in. Because access to energy will guarantee, jobs for our people, in terms of young people who are going to self-employ themselves, through various, business, initiatives that, of course, will require energy, welding, and so on and so forth. Yeah. But the biggest challenge we have in the continent, like I did mention, is that there are three important factors when you're talking about energy. There is access, there is reliability of that energy, and there is also affordability of that energy. Yeah. The fact that electricity line passes near your home does not necessarily mean that you have access to that power. Yeah. And the fact that that power is connected to you does not necessarily mean it's actually reliable. And again, it goes now on to say the question of affordability. How affordable is our energy? And as we think about calling upon investors to also come and invest in Africa, and that's what the president has been also focusing on, saying that, hey, look here, you can also come and take advantage of our clean energy and probably invest here. But how reliable is that energy, and how, of course, affordable is that particular energy? So we need to be very careful about then how we even tax energy. If you look at you were talking, for example, the amount of money that you actually pay in tax, as you buy those particular tokens, is quite, massive. So you have to look at the tax regime and how we address that. But there's also the question of who owns the energy. When we talk about the monopoly that, for example, we have in Kenya, KBC has been a monopoly, in energy, for example. But how do we make it easy, for other investors to also produce energy and sell to the national grid? If we can actually make that easy, that possible, we facilitate, that. And I think the leaders in Africa, the heads of state, also committed that they are going to work on policies. They are going to ensure that we have, policies that are actually friendly to green growth. And I think we need to address energy in the first place, to ensure that we have investors coming in to invest in energy, but also making sure that energy is affordable, is accessible, and it's also reliable.
And also help us understand here, I mean, you see, why is it a problem for Europe, for North America, for China, that 600 million Africans do not have access to electricity? How is it their problem? I mean, is it not up to African countries to ensure that their population or its population has access to electricity?
Yes, of course, it remains, a primary role of the African governments to ensure that they invest heavily in energy and energy that's going to spur growth. But again, remember, energy is also a very big factor when it comes to the conversion around climate change. Why? Because of course, our use, our approach in terms of using coal, fossil fuels, to generate, power, and so on and so forth. And we've been talking about transitioning and moving to clean energy sources. And Africa, the beauty of it is that we are endowed with all these resources, like I was mentioning.
But they're expensive.
The good thing, at least we have solar, for example. We have wind. We have not even exploited in Kenya, for example, 10% of our geothermal potential. But you see, those natural resources will only remain as natural resources. But without technologies to exploit them, they remain useless.
Do we have the technology?
That is a big question. And one of the conversations we've been having at the global stage is how do we ensure this technology transfer? From where this technology is, to Africa, to help us in terms of, exploiting some of these energy potential that we have in the continent, but also to be able to address the question of climate change and adaptation, for our people. And I think that is a big challenge because this technology transfer is not happening. You get the point. But I think we also need to invest also in research in the continent of Africa. We need to actually come up with our own endogenous, research and come up with technologies and support those of us that are doing some good work. There's one professor in Cameroon, in one of the universities, who is actually really reading, the process of coming up with very simple technologies, for harvesting solar and so on and so forth. And some of those initiatives, and I think in Kenya we also have the same. We even have institutions that are actually focusing on, research in the same. We need to invest so much in research. I think we are doing not very well in terms of how we invest in research, so that we can also come up with our own homemade technologies, even as we continue pushing the North to actually transfer technologies that we need for us to be able to exploit these. Because when they come from outside, they're also quite expensive. The machineries and so on and so forth are quite expensive, and that also makes our energy expensive in the long run.
I mean, look, I think, at some point we like to direct our, our problems to where they are not supposed to be directed. Because, I mean, look, when you look at on average, Africa has been independent for more than 60 years now. Most African countries, they got their independence from their colonizers, in the 60s. And when you look at the African continent, I mean, you still have about 600 million people, without access to electricity. You still have about 400 million people without access to safe drinking water. You still have another 700 million people without access to proper sanitation. Should we be bringing this issue to the world's attention? I mean, I thought this is our own problem we need to deal with. We need to create strategies on how to deal with these. Why should it become a global issue, honestly?
Thank you so much, O'Brien. And like I did mention, it's primarily, our own African, issue that we need to address. Of course, support is still needed from the West. That is still needed. But we have to also think internally how we approach our issues. The head of public service has just talked about issues of corruption within government, parastatals and departments. And until we stem out some of those, systemic challenges we have within our systems, we will always be going around in circles. So we need to be more efficient in terms of how we utilize our resources. We must stem out corruption within the government systems. But again, we must also, enhance, our use of domestic resources and appropriating those resources, in the right manner. Right now, we have the devolved, system of governance. How well are we supporting the counties, in terms of rolling out some of these, issues that we need to roll out at the very local level, because we really have to localize, our approach. Even climate response is about relocalizing, our interventions to ensure that services reach the common, people, people at the front end of the climate crisis. So we need to deal with those systemic, challenges. But again, we need to have long-term planning, long-term plans, that also responsive to the needs of our people. But the challenge with our governance is the fact that when I come to power, what I want to do is to trash whatever plans that everybody else, had come up with. And I want to come up with new, magical ideas, And then, of course, we leave, whatever probably had actually been initiated. If we can be very, consistent and systematic in terms of how, we plan our development. And it's clear because we have counties have their CIDPs, county development, plans, for example. We have our blueprints, we have, for example, our NDCs, our National Determined Contribution, documents, which is a good blueprint that touches on the sectors that you actually did mention, transport, energy, and so on and so forth. And it has very clear, plans on how then we need to address this. But I think one challenge we have is that we have good policies, but when it comes in now translating those policies into implementation of the ground, we fail terribly. And that's a very big problem. So you really have to connect, our policies with implementation plans and, of course, resources that goes into supporting implementation of such plans.
And I like that you're bringing in the issue of planning, because as part of the declaration was the fact that, the conference raised the concern that, urbanization in Africa is rapidly growing, and our cities, are under huge pressure from, the huge rural to urban migration. And, according to estimates, urban centers and cities in Africa, they will accommodate about 1 billion people. Now, without proper planning, this is expected to be a big problem. So then how do we inculcate a culture of planning, a culture of ensuring that we come up with sustainable planning methods? Because, you go to some of the cities in Europe, you realize that their plannings were done more than 2,000 years ago. You go, for example, to Rome, you discover that the infrastructure there was planned more than 1,000 years, and it is still working. But when you come to Africa, we don't have those kind of plans. Do we really need the West to come and help us, in planning our cities, honestly?
That's a good question. In fact, we are getting urbanized at a very, very high rate. Actually, by 2050, like you did mention, more than 1 billion people will be living in the cities in the continent of Africa. But at the moment, we're already struggling, with a lot of infrastructure challenges. Talk about transport infrastructure, talk about especially, water infrastructure. We hardly have enough water in Nairobi. Even with the population that we have at the moment, and so is the case with many particular cities, and therefore we must act quickly. We must think very, very, we must be very decisive in terms of how we plan, and planning, thinking about the increasing population, because our population is projected to continue increasing, in the continent of Africa. Actually, this is where population will continue increasing even as other areas remain stagnant or probably going down, and we must be very decisive in terms of how we do this. But like I did mention, these cities are now located in the counties. At the moment, we are working with the United Cities and Local Governments Authority, institution, that is working, with the cities and municipalities across Africa in ensuring that we build, resilient, cities, across the continent. But I think this, as much as possible, has to be a devolved, function. We must empower, our subnational jurisdictions, our subnational, governments. In Kenya, for example, we are talking about county governments. In other regions, it could be a different arrangement. But I think we must really embrace local level action and put enough resources. How much money are we giving to the counties, for example? Like I say, we are talking about El Nino. And El Nino is likely to destroy, road infrastructure, water infrastructure, the sewer infrastructure. In Nairobi, we saw what happened when we had flooding the other day. A lot of challenges, that come with the same. So, but how do we support our local governments, our county governments, to ensure that they have enough resources to be able to put some of these particular measures in place? But how do we also enhance, also revenue collection, at that particular level to ensure that these counties are also self-sustaining in one way or the other? I think that is quite critical. But again, the other issue is that we also need to see a lot of harmony within how governments, institutions works. At the moment, we're seeing a lot of silo, mentality in terms of how you address issues. So the environment ministry is thinking on one side, but again, whatever they're doing is not necessarily connected with the Ministry of Health, for example. We did pose a question to the ministers of health in a convening we had at the Africa Climate Summit, discussing health and climate change. And we did ask the ministers who had attended that particular meeting, how many of the ministers of health are actually involved within the climate change committees within their governments. And you realize there are very few that are, in that particular committee, for example. When we've been discussing AMSEN, Africa Ministerial Conference on Environment, where the environment ministers come and meet and, of course, they discuss matters, climate change. One of the questions that we did ask is, a lot of issues that they raised are that we need resources to be able to implement plans that they have, on environment. But you see, the African ministers also meet the finance ministers also meet in their own forum. For example, at what point do we connect, these conversations, between the ministers of finance, the ministers of environment, the ministers of health, and indeed all those other ministries, of course, within the continent. So we need to see a lot of harmony in terms of how governments work and how, of course, planning happens, so that we think as one, because one ministry has an impact on the other in terms of how then we connect our operations.
As part of the declaration, I mean, there was a clarion call that, rich nations should honor their commitment to provide $100 billion in annual climate financing, which was one of the promises made in 2009 during the Copenhagen talks. And 2009, now we are in 2024. Clearly, should we still be waiting for the $100 billion? I mean, by now, we should know that this is not likely to happen, and or if it is happening, then it is happening in other way, and craft a strategy of moving forward. Should we still be talking about the West or the rich countries honoring their commitment today?
I think that is one narrative that we must not really, forget. It's a narrative that we must continue, advancing, because, like I did mention, the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, that must really be upheld. They have emitted more, so they need to give more. 20%, about 20 countries are responsible for 80% of the emissions, but they also control 80% of the GDP, global GDP.
Yeah.
So the resources are there. If there's a political commitment, if there's only that political commitment to actually avail resources, I think that can actually be able to can actually happen. But 14 years down the line, we haven't seen much. Even here in Nairobi, we had a lot of commitments, declarations and announcements, but that remains, those remains just declarations. We need to see, those resources actually flowing. But more importantly, we need to look at the current, state of negotiations. We have what we're calling NCQG, New Collective and Quantified Finance Goal. It's a new goal altogether that is being discussed, and I think we need to be more decisive in terms of how then we arrive, at a goal, that is acceptable to all. Remember, even the 100 billion was not based on anything. It was just but a political statement, a feel-good sort of statement. It was not informed by actual needs of the people. Like I did mention, adaptation alone has a gap of 340 billion per year by 2030. Now, even this 100 billion, even if it was availed, that cannot be able to bridge, that particular gap. And notwithstanding the fact that it's never even saw the light of the day. We are discussing about doubling of adaptation finance. And those are commitments, of course, taken by developed countries in the previous, in Glasgow, and we needed to see a lot of commitment in terms of then how that doubling happens. But again, we are saying even doubling may not take us where we are supposed to be, but at least it will be some progress towards that direction. We are now discussing global goal for adaptation, which has been a discussion that has gathered, pace, and really it is really gaining traction. But in the conversations around the same, and you were in Germany during the SB 58, where there were conversations around the same. You realize that when it comes to means of implementation and coming up with a framework for the global goal adaptation, the conversation around the means of implementation sometimes brings a lot of back and forth and a tug of war. Because means of implementation means that we have to avail resources to ensure that this particular goal, of course, is achieved. And we need to be clear in terms of how then are we going to operationalize this framework and in terms of the resources and so on and so forth. And that has been a very, very big bottleneck. So what we're calling for is a political commitment by developed country partners to make sure that at least they honor what they commit. Commit, but then at least honor. Doubling of adaptation finance, at least let's see some progress towards that direction. We have now loss and damage facility established, but how long are we going to take in terms of now making sure it is operationalized, making sure it is well resourced? Remember, when we got a decision on adaptation finance, it took, or adaptation fund, so to say, it took 7 years between the time that decision was arrived at and when it was actually operationalized. So are we going to see the same trend with loss and damage facility, or are we going to see something different? One thing, however, that we need to be careful about is that we need to be careful about procedures and proposals that also commercialize climate change. Now, loss and damage conversation is now gravitating towards conversion around insurance. Now, this insurance, is it in any way going to have a net positive effect in Africa? Or are we going to have a net, oozing of resources from the continent? Because these insurance companies, of course, will be based from, somewhere. The resources, of course, will be controlled by a certain particular probably company, which is probably not Africa. And we'll be forced, of course, now to insure our people against some of these particular impacts. So it's going to be business. The carbon thing, which has become a big, big debate again. It's being proposed as a mechanism through which Africa can be able to get resources to support adaptation. In other words, this challenge is actually being taken back to us. That work in terms of making sure that you support adaptation. But the net effect again of carbon trade, does it support Africa, or are we, losing, in terms of whatever resources come through and the investment that we put into the same.
Mm-hmm. And so when you look at the Nairobi declaration, it is full of we urge, we request, we commit. But is there anything else that can be done beyond that? Because when you go through that document, and there are about 65 points in that document, you see a lot of pleas from Africa to the West that please contribute more towards our water sustainability project, contribute more to renewable energy, contribute more to futuristic planning. I mean, you don't hear concrete conclusions from the African governments that we are going to commit this so much resources towards doing A, B, C, D. And this is going to be our performance tracking mechanisms. That one is missing out. So how do we track performance of ourselves as Africa?
That's a very, very big, actually that's a $1 million question, Brian. And I remember when we went for AMSEN in Addis Ababa, just before the start of the Africa Climate Summit, we had a meeting for the major groups. And one of the issues that we were looking at were how AMSEN, Africa Ministerial Conference of Environment, how decisions, are pushed. And we said there have been a lot of decisions within that particular conference or that particular framework. But you see, implementation is actually almost zero. Nothing much has actually happened. And one of the issues that we also raised is the fact that if you look at the declaration that comes from the AMSEN, from the Africa Ministerial Conference on Environment, is that it's about we urge, we call, just the same rhetoric that we are now hearing with the Africa Climate Summit. And if you look at our statement as non-state actors that we released immediately after the declaration was read out, that point that you raised is actually one of the concerns that we actually had. That we did not see a clear roadmap from our heads of state. Of course, they did commission the African Union or request the African Union to actually come up with modalities on how this is going to be taken forward. But we needed to see our leaders being more decisive. We cannot just keep on saying, we appeal, we plead,
we request.
We need to have some clear, roadmap and action plan. That for sure, this is what we are requesting the northern government to do. And we are going to make a follow-up meeting with them on this and this particular area, on this particular issue. I think we need to see some little bit, focus in terms of some roadmap, some clear action point in terms of how we move forward. Otherwise, this particular declaration will end up, joining all the other declarations that have been made, in various, convenings on climate change. And again, we are going to form yet another, trend, that will be happening after every 2 years, and we may not achieve, what we really want to achieve. So we need to see that, because heads of state coming together from almost the entire continent, that was a very, very massive, it was actually a massive force, that could have actually probably come up with some clear action points in terms of how we drive this process forward. Otherwise, they just told us the normal things that we've been hearing.
And of course, we have the African Union, the AU that brings together all the 54 states in Africa. And so the question is then, how do we move this conversation forward? How do we ensure that the outcomes that were captured out of the Nairobi declaration, we develop an implementation mechanism. We develop a performance matrix. And of course, we ensure that countries commit as part of their budget, to fund specific project, that will go towards dealing with climate change. Of course, we'll be continuing with this conversation going forward. But before now, I let you go because our time is well spent. In 30 seconds, I want to hear this from you. What should happen next now that the conference was held, the document is in place? What happens in 30 seconds?
Thank you so much. The declaration is there. At least we have several conferences coming up, one of them being United Nations General Assembly, where the president is of course attending, among other heads of state and other leaders. And he's already, of course, discussing that particular document. But most importantly, we have COP28 coming up, in Dubai. Yeah. And this document will form a very, very big probable portion of the African position. So it's upon now the Africa group of negotiators, first and foremost, to look at this particular declaration and probably extract information that would actually be used to beef up, or to beef, this position that is going to be developed, for Africa, for COP. That is going to be very useful. So if we can make reference to that document and pick some of the critical issues to feed into a common African position, that would be good. The African Union has now the mandate, now to think about then how we push this forward. But most importantly, we have to strengthen our African Union. As it stands now, it's not even well resourced. The other thing is that I don't think it is even empowered enough to be able to actually, canvas a common African position and be able to move us where we need to be. So our African heads of state have a duty also to make sure they strengthen that institution. The Pan-African Parliament is an institution operating under the African Union. And I think that is another powerhouse that we can be able to use, in terms of especially domesticating some of the provisions of the declaration that have got to do with inward-looking, processes. And they're already discussing a model law. We facilitated a process here in Nairobi during the Africa Climate Summit where Pan-African parliamentarians sat and they discussed, how they're going to progress in terms of coming up with a model climate law, which can actually be domesticated in the countries and which can actually be useful in ensuring that at least some of the commitment by African leaders that are actually inward-looking can actually be anchored in law to ensure that we're able to progress.
Very good. Charles Mwangi, thank you very much indeed. We'll continue to engage to see where this conversation takes us next. Otherwise, your time is highly appreciated. Asante sana.
Thank you so very much.
Very good. Charles Mwangi is the head of programs at the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, joining us this morning to help us break down the Nairobi Declaration on Climate Change and call for action. And of course, you have heard it from him. You're watching the Score Base Check. We are live from Broadcasting House. Our conversation next will be tracking the performance of the Kenyan economy. And so we'll be looking at the economic update. Stay right here. Our guest is in the house.
Was going along fine until you went in to see my
please,
son.
That is enough. Stop blaming Isabel for everything that happened.
I just want us to get past what has happened. You see, I'm getting rid of projects at the company because I want to spend more time with you.
Damage you suffered to your spine is irreversible. I am very sorry, Silvio, but you are paralyzed. You will never walk again.
If you look here, it has obviously been cut with a knife.
It was cut off with the intention to kill you.
Katika Qur'ani, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala anasema kuwa enyi mlioamini, ogopeni siku ambayo mtarejea kwa Mola wenu.
Yule ambaye atakayefanya matendo mazuri, akaswali, akajistiri, akafanya ibada inavyotakikana, basi yeye ataona heri yake siku ya kiyama.
Muhammad is and always will be the last and final prophet of Allah.
Hii ni yenyu. Apology accepted.
Asante sana.
Wacha nikulete hizo utaintroduce uone.
This is a good day.
Sikuta kutoka bwana yako sana na usiku. Ndio utanielewa. Sasa hizo huwezi nielewa.
This one is always a victim.
I've been there, done that.
Do you know I can do something to you right now and Jane will be my alibi? She will lie for me.
Of course I will.
Yaani Christine wanitishia maisha yangu wewe.
Jackie, get out. What if she decides to keep the baby with the help of Pete?
That's a tough spot to be in. I won't lie.
This is Gaki. I do modeling, dancing, singing, and acting.
He shared so many of these stories that they still bear his name to this day. They are called Aesop's Fables.
So today I'm going to show you guys how to make some chocolate chip cupcakes. I know they're going to be amazing.
I'm going to teach you how to use some paper to paint like watercolor.
Hodi, hodi, October.
Well, the Kenyan economy is facing serious headwinds, you know, some of them globally, others they just local. And so the question has always been, you know, how do we keep the economy going and how do we ensure that we maintain economic growth, which according to the National Treasury is supposed to reach about 6.5% this year. Well, from inflation to the high cost of energy and to the high cost of servicing, you know, our national debt, these are some of the issues that are dragging our economy down. And this, of course, is having ripple effect on many other sectors of the economy. And so the question is, what is the status of our economy today? Well, joining us is Peter Mashari. He's the CEO of Jijenge Credit. He will be helping us to navigate through this program and, of course, help us with more of insight on what is really happening. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Peter. First of all, give us an update on where are we? How is our economy doing? Are we sailing in safe waters, or what's happening?
Thank you, O'Brien, for inviting me. And once again, thank you to our viewers for watching KBC. The current state of the Kenyan economy is picking up. We can say it's been low, but currently it's trying to pick up. And we are going against several external international shocks. That is, the dollar is quite, the exchange rate for the shilling against the dollar, it's quite high. The cost of fuel is also quite high, and the Ukraine war is still on. But generally, as a country, we are resilient, we are hopeful, and I believe the technocrats at the Ministry of Finance, CBK, Treasury are not sleeping. They are burning the midnight oil to help mitigate all that.
You know, when you look at you know, what we are calling the internal and external shocks, from the war in Ukraine to the rising cost of fuel now to those are some of the international or exogenous shocks that we are dealing with. But when you look at you know, internally, we have the issues around you know, debt servicing, the issues of recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, among many others. Which one do you think are having more impact on the Kenyan economy?
Well, we can say it's been a spillover from COVID, because COVID had a major shock locally and internationally, because most of the businesses were shut down, most government operations were also shut down. And that one impacted negatively on the government in terms of revenue, because the main source of revenue for government is tax and debt. So during COVID, tax collection was a bare minimum. And then we had a drought. Immediately after COVID, we had elections, then there was a drought, then we have the issue of the Ukraine war and the high cost of fuel, which is also being instigated by OPEC, which controls the oil supply in the world and prices.
And look, we are just coming from a debilitating COVID-19 pandemic, which brought the world economy almost to its knees. And do you still feel that we are still going through the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, or would you say that we have gotten to a point where now we can say that we have recovered confidently?
Well, we've not yet recovered from COVID because the effects were long-term, and most manufacturers have not yet restored maximum productivity. Like vehicle manufacturers in Japan and other countries, they had to restore maximum vehicle production. And it will take time because as they try to restore normalcy, there are other external shocks that are coming on board and affecting the speed and rate at which the recovery would have been fast. But all said and done, Kenyans are resilient. We are people we are hardworking, we are focused, and we also put God ahead of everything, and the believers will succeed.
At the end of the day, we are prayerful nation.
Yes, yes.
That's what we say.
Yes,
but do you feel that, and I know that, Professor Jogon Ndongo, the National Treasury Cabinet Secretary, is very deliberate, to steer the Kenyan economy on the right path. And one of the government's key target is to reduce our national debt from about 9 trillion shillings to manageable levels, so that we also reduce our servicing, our debt servicing expenses. Do you see concrete steps, towards doing this?
Well, concrete steps are definitely there because the team at Treasury is a competent team. However, the external shocks, especially the issue of the dollar, is really impacting negatively on their speedy recovery. Because as at yesterday, the national debt crossed the 10 trillion mark.
Yeah.
And that definitely means that we'll definitely have to go deeper into our pockets and service the debts. And definitely the cost of servicing, or the money that is required to service the debts, must come from within our borders, either through tax or we borrow, either internally or externally.
And this explains why, the government, has been very aggressive, in terms of reforming our tax administration systems, as well as, coming up with new taxation measures. For example, from July, workers, the government implemented the housing levy. And we have also seen, a lot of reforms, going or happening at the Kenya Revenue Authority to try and align our tax systems to boost the level of collections. And so this is, of course, going to be painful, in the medium term, but of course, in the long term, we are likely to bear fruits. But the question then comes, how then do we do all these? Do we come up with new taxation measures, become more aggressive in tax collections, but at the same time we ensure that we do not hurt an already hurting population?
That's a very good question, because experts always say that you should not tax the residents of a country into poverty. And it calls for a lot of balancing, a very delicate balancing act, so that as you increase the tax collection, you should not hurt the
taxpayer.
The taxpayer, or rather the hen that lays the golden egg. and therefore the best solution is to widen the tax bracket, so that the people who are easier to tax from can be saved from further taxation, and instead we widen the tax and tax as many people as possible. And that one calls for very innovative methods, very innovative ways, and a lot of research, so that you can identify the areas, the grey areas where tax or taxation has not been effected. Yes.
And the issue of inflation, I mean, you know, it continues to be a major challenge, and we have seen, you know, the National Treasury, you know, trying to steer the economy in a bid to bring down the level of inflation in this country. And we know that, you know, the policy band is between 5.7%, I mean 5.5% to 7.5%, but now it is well above this. We are looking at 9%. And so are you convinced that the measures that the National Treasury has put in place, you know, are working towards reducing inflation?
Definitely, yes. The measures that have been put in place to manage and control inflation are in top gear. One of the main measures that the governments use to control inflation is by increasing the interest rates, so that there is less money that is lent out to businesses and to individuals. As at yesterday, the interest rate, or rather this week, the interest rate was averaging 18%. 18% per annum. And therefore, it's a good measure to control the effects of inflation, because if it is not managed, it can go overboard, especially because of the external shocks like cost of fuel, and most of the other goods like electricity has also gone up, and therefore all those effects are pushing inflation up.
And when you look at the performance of the Kenya shilling, it has been on a downward spiral, you know, receiving major beatings from major global currencies, from the euro, Japanese yen, to the US dollar, to the Chinese yuan. The shilling, you know, is losing significant ground. Is there anything that we can do to stem a further decline of the Kenyan shilling?
There are measures that can be taken, and the first one is maybe to reduce, or rather to improve our balance of payment, because ideally the shilling gets weaker against the dollar because of we import more. Most of the things that are imported, the policymakers need to come up with a policy or develop a measure or a way whereby we can empower and spur manufacturing, local manufacturing, or even spur more agricultural exports. And I believe the government is on it. I know the Minister of Agriculture is trying his best to improve the agricultural segment and sector, so that we can have more exports. We can export more coffee, we can export more tea, we can export more nuts, macadamia, all the other, or anything that we're able to export after consuming locally, that should be encouraged, so that we are able to reduce our balance of payment. And once that one is done, our shilling will be very strong against the dollar. Then the other issue is to do what some of other African countries are doing, which I think that one could be very tricky. That is joining or encouraging other currencies, so that we stop over-reliance on the dollar, so that we don't buy all our imports using the dollar. You can use Japanese yen. Other countries have joined the BRICS. Other countries have proposed to we have even suggested a different measure or method of purchasing oil or petroleum products by doing government to government, so that most of the currencies that are involved there, the dollar is, we use more of the Kenyan currency as opposed to the dollar.
But the question that is coming out, you know, when you float those kind of ideas, you know, whereby you're trading in local currencies, is so what are the other countries, for example, you know, Saudi Arabia, where there were, you know, the government entered into a government-to-government oil purchase deal. What would Saudi Arabia do with the Kenyan shilling? And what would we do with the... Yes, for us, we may buy their product, which is oil. But what would they do with the Kenyan shilling?
Well, those are now the areas that we need to bring on board research and find out whether they consume Kenyan tea. We can sell the Kenyan tea to them, or coffee, yeah, in exchange of the fuel. So those are areas that we need to do a lot of.
Can we also explore the option of barter trade?
Yeah.
Whereby they give us oil,
yes,
we give them tea,
yes,
we give them coffee,
yeah, or we export labor.
Or we export labor,
yeah,
for example.
Yeah, yeah.
So what we need, are we really putting this kind of ideas into action?
Well, I believe there must be someone who maybe is listening to our ideas, and they are being put in place, so that all those challenges that we are facing as a country are mitigated.
Look, when you talk about debt repayment, and this is something that you touched on. You know, when you look at the year 2016, you know, Kenya spent about 216 billion shillings to repay debt. In the last 9 months to March this year, Kenya spent about 817 billion Kenya shillings to repay debt. And this is even way above the recurrent expenditure of the government, which was about 600 and something billion shillings. And so, you know, debt repayment is really grabbing a significant portion of our revenue. Is there any way then we can renegotiate our debt position with our creditors to ensure that we don't put undue pressure on the Kenyan shilling?
That's a very good question. Definitely there are ways of reducing the pressure on the debt repayment policies. And I think the major challenge is the weakening of the Kenya shilling, because any time the shilling depreciates by 1 shilling, because all our debts, we are paying them in dollars, the installments increase by that 1 shilling. So if our dollar was, we had a loan of $1 million, and the shilling depreciates by 1 shilling, so that debt goes up by 1 million. Therefore, I think the best thing would be to look at the interest rates. We need to shy away and run away from expensive debts. And the best way is to, number one,
commercial loans.
Yes, we need to renegotiate the repayment period, the terms, and even seek for lower interest rates. And also see whether you can get grants where we are given a moratorium, a window, a repayment window of maybe 3 years, so that within those 3 years we have a breathing space to be able to generate more income and hope that the dollar goes down, because once the Kenya shillings gets stronger, we also save on the loan installment amounts. Yes.
The other thing is the fact that you know, a lot of this debt, you know, was borrowed for us to invest in major infrastructural projects. You have the SGR, you have the ring roads, you have you know, an expanded port of Mombasa, you have you know, the Lamu port. You know, we also saw the expansion of Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, Kisumu Airport, Malindi, Mombasa. And so are we also thinking about, have you also sat down and say, look here, I mean, we invested in all these projects, but are we putting better utilization of these projects? If it is a question of investment in agriculture, have we improved our agricultural production? If it is a question of our ports? Have we improved efficiency, at the ports of Mombasa, at the ports of Lamu, so that we ensure that we attract more business?
That's a very good question. It also came up yesterday during the Auditor General's report. And she was proposing that each debt that we have as a country should be tied to the project it did, so that we're able to do that analysis, so that we're able to identify and say whether that debt or that project is sustaining itself and it's generating income to repay the debt, or how is it being managed. For example, if we took a debt for the SGR, that particular debt should be tied to the SGR, so that whatever income is generated, first of all, it's directed to repay that debt, and then you're able to identify the shortfall. And it's a very good way of auditing projects, because we will be able to zero in and identify the projects that are serving Kenyans and projects that are not serving Kenyans, and therefore we can make a first decision on how to reorganize our finances and support maybe projects that need to be completed so that they can generate some income or serve Kenyans.
You see, when you look, for example, and I like that you're talking about, SGR, and according to the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, they are saying that standard gauge railway revenue increased by 6.4% to 15.3 billion shillings in the 12 months leading to December 2022. And so then do we audit and ask ourselves, when you talk about revenue increasing to 15 billion shillings, on the SGR, is that the best that SGR can do? Is there anything else then we need to do to increase the haulage of cargo on the SGR so that it can realize more profit and so it can repay its own loan? Are you convinced that we are carrying out this kind of analysis?
Well, we can say that as from yesterday, I think after that question was floated to the Director Generals of various state corporations, they will need to reanalyze and find out, like the question you're asking, is the SGR serving us optimally? Is it generating as much revenue as it should? Because SGR was supposed to go past Naivasha. The question we would ask is, was it meant to, is Naivasha the end of was it supposed to be the end point? Or once the goods are removed from the port, what are they being dropped at Naivasha?
They're supposed to go all the way up to Webuye.
Exactly, so that
and then from Webuye it goes to Uganda.
Exactly,
from Uganda it goes to DRC Congo.
That is now where we derive maximum use of the SGR. You should be able to go and deliver goods to as much near the point of use as possible. Because if it is a fuel that is being taken to Uganda by SGR, the SGR should go all the way to Uganda and maybe serve other tertiary towns within the country, either Kisumu or Eldoret, and so that it hives off the load and the cost of repairs for the main highway, and it goes to SGR. Yes.
You see, and I like the fact that you're bringing in the issue of, extending the SGR so that we can realize, the full benefits of SGR. I mean, the whole plan was to ensure that, once the goods are evacuated from the port of Mombasa, they are taken directly to Busia, where now, they cross over to Uganda to serve the Ugandan market, Burundi, Rwanda, as well as the DRC market. But this is not happening. So you still have a situation whereby a lot of goods are, is evacuated from the port of Mombasa, and then the termination point is at Naivasha, whereby now you also have to think about how now to evacuate your goods from Naivasha dry port now to the other destinations in the region. And so this is becoming a headache for investors. And so then, should we then start having a conversation as to how then do we raise enough resources then to extend SGR to its original destination?
Definitely we'll have to explore either do we need to get resources to complete the railway, or do we need to get public-private partnership so that we can reduce the over-reliance on debts to do the extension. And all those are cards that should be put on the table so that we look at the best possible option that will not hurt Kenyans. And therefore, we as a country, we really need to balance so many things. Do a feasibility study on the viability of extending the railway. Also do another study on the financial options that we can take that will serve Kenyans. And therefore settle on one, which should be the best possible option. Yeah.
And now the conversation that is taking place within government circles, and this point was buttressed by the Parliamentary Budget Office, PBO, where they are advising the National Treasury now, instead of borrowing more to invest in infrastructure, now to borrow more to repay Kenya's maturing debt. And so, we're likely to see less investment in new infrastructural projects, but a lot of our budget will go towards, repaying our debts. So what exactly then does this mean? And bearing in mind that infrastructure development is is a major driver of economic growth.
Well, it's a good proposal because technically it means that all the projects, all the investments that had been financed or that had borrowed funds should be completed so that we get the optimal use of them. And the faster we complete those projects, the better, because we might end up paying loans for projects that are not complete. Mm-hmm. And that one will be a looming disaster because we will continue in that rat race whereby we borrow to pay a debt. And the project that was meant to be financed by that debt is not serving anybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what I'm hearing from you is it is high time, number one, we took an audit of all our debts. Mm-hmm. And then number two, we undertake an audit of all projects whereby if we borrowed money for this project, we need to do an audit to discover or to find out whether the project was completed. Mm-hmm. If it is not completed, then what's happened? Mm-hmm. And then how do we ensure that we complete this project? This is not happening, or is it happening?
Well, what I know for sure is that, and from the Auditor General's report, there is no new project that is running. I will need to look at it again and find out whether the projects that were implemented in yesteryears and the ones that we had borrowed funds for, were they completed, especially the roads. I know there are some roads that we had borrowed, like the Momo Road. Are they complete? Because there's no need of, it's like borrowing money to put up a flat or an apartment. Then you leave it at halfway and you had borrowed. And then you stay for 2-3 years without progressing. That apartment becomes run down because the weather will ravage on it. So many, the loss will be unsurmountable.
So you're looking to have what we call cost overruns.
Exactly, or white projects.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, you have now to spend more money to rehabilitate the same apartment.
Yes.
And then, of course, because of inflation, the cost of borrowing will be up.
Yes.
And so that's a challenge of, having projects that are not complete. But let's now bring in the issue of borrowing. And I know that, you're in the space of credit financing. Mm. How has this impacted the cost of credit? You talked about the average cost of a loan now averaging about 18%, and this is likely to keep away borrowers because of the high interest rate. So how is the credit market impacted by the ongoing cost of living issues?
Well, the credit market has been impacted partly negatively because very few people are borrowing also. However, that should be the aim of the policymakers, so that we have less funds or less money out there in the market because of the high inflation rate. However, we should encourage new businesses, new startups, so that with the new businesses and new expansions, we're able to lend and gradually spur more businesses to operate and spur business growth. If that segment is left unattended, by and large, we might end up now collecting less tax because there are fewer businesses that are operating, fewer businesses that are borrowing for expansion, and therefore the tax collection margins are affected. Yes.
So what measures should the government put in place? And I'm talking about the central bank as well as the National Treasury. What measures should they put in place to ensure that, the cost of credit is maintained? I know we tried, interest caps. It never worked. And so the market was left open. Now you're talking about, the cost of credit, the average, being 18%. So this is likely to have a major impact, on development, because a lot of businesses are likely to find it tough to borrow. Have you also seen a rise in cases of non-performing loans?
Well, non-performing loans are definitely on the rise. Because if you look at the latest CBK report, I think it was released 2 weeks ago, it was saying 60% of loans are not being paid. 60% of the total loans are not being paid. And that
so you only have 40%?
Yeah, that is being serviced. And that clearly shows that the business segment is not on the right path. Then on the part of the high interest rates that are being offered by the banks, my recommendation would be that the government reduces its local borrowing. Because a bank would prefer to lend to the government, which is less risky, less cumbersome, less paperwork, than to lend to an individual who is high risk, more paperwork, more monitoring, and has very uncertain, and during this time, business survival is very uncertain. Therefore, those are now the two competing forces. Yeah.
And I was going through the central bank report where it was saying that, credit to the private sector, registered some marginal growth in the period to June, whereby it's registered a growth of 12.2%. And this compares to, it was 13% compared to 12.2% in May, which means that, Kenyans are still willing to borrow, so that they can expand their businesses and so much. But also now you're bringing the issue of non-repayment of loans. And then on the other hand, banks are becoming more concerned lending to people because of the high rates of non-performing loans. So then how then do we strike a balance? Because at the end of the day, the private sector is a key driver of economic growth. And so when the private sector is not borrowing, then there's going to be a challenge, when it comes to economic growth. So how then do we ensure that there is credit supply to the private sector, and then there is credit repayment from the private sector?
Number one is what I've mentioned earlier, that if the government reduces borrowing locally, there will be a lot of money to lend to the public. And definitely that one would mean that it will spur economic growth. Interest rates would reduce marginally, and therefore, and even the tax bracket would widen, because if you're borrowing to increase production, then it means that you will pay more tax. If you're buying to open, or rather to expand, it will mean that you'll employ more Kenyans and tax collection would increase. And my proposal is we reduce government borrowing. Locally, they go to foreign, they put more emphasis on foreign debt or foreign borrowing. They encourage MSMEs to grow, to expand, to get cheaper loans, and even to employ more, because MSMEs are also the highest employer. Apart from the government, the other second group that employs the highest number of Kenyans is MSMEs. So that now the wider the businesses open up, or the more the businesses open up, the wider the tax collection bracket. Yes.
You see, during the last meeting, the Central Bank of Kenya, through the Monetary Policy Committee, they raised the benchmark rates to 10.5%. But on the other hand, we have seen, the rate of inflation easing to 6.7%. From 7.3% in July. And so, on one hand, the cost of living is improving, but on the other hand, the central bank is keen on retaining the benchmark rate at 10%. What are they trying to do? Aren't they supposed then to also ease the benchmark rate so that they can spur, more credit to the private sector?
All I can say is that CBK is doing the right thing, and it's on track, because they have to balance maintaining slightly high interest rates at 10.5%, and also managing the rate of inflation. And rate of inflation is being spurred, or is being brought about by the high cost of goods. So the excess money in the market needs to be mopped up by increasing the interest rates, and reducing the local borrowing within the market. So that within 1 or 2 months, once that one eases, now CBK can start reducing the rates gradually.
So as we wind up this interview, what advice do you have, for people who are struggling to make it? What are the tips that they should employ? Number one, to keep their businesses afloat, and number two, to tap into new customers.
Thank you. Number one is to ensure that you come up with a very strict cost control measures. Ensure that you have a budget. You're able to track any coin that you spend vis-a-vis any coin that you generate, or any income that you get. So that now from the budget that you've developed, you strictly follow that. We should, at personal level, avoid impulse buying. We should avoid buying things that are on offer. And we also need to go back to and look at our expenses, because there are things that have increased, but very few people have noted those small increases, like the cost of fuel, cost of electricity, and therefore we need to readjust. Be it a business, be it an individual, we need to readjust ourselves to fit into those budgets, so that generally, and as an overview, we live within our means. Yeah.
Very good. Yeah. Anything else?
Well, what I can say is that Kenyans are resilient. We hope for the best, and we are going to overcome. It's a matter of time, then everything will stabilize, and we look forward for the best.
Very good. Yeah. Peter Wachira, thank you very much for finding time to be with us this morning, and it's almost now coming to midday. Otherwise, your time is highly appreciated.
Thank you.
Very good. Peter Wachira is the CEO of Jijenge Credit, helping us to understand and to evaluate the status of our economy as we stand. The fact of the matter is times are tough. But the fact of the matter is the government is also doing something to try and ease the burden on the cost of living. Well, we have been watching us live from Broadcasting House. This has been Base Check. We started the hour off with the Nairobi Declaration and, of course, tracking the third critical documents. And we are wrapping it up with a look at Kenya's economic status. Well, my name is O'Brien Kimani. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Kurunzi Mashinani is coming up with her lead. Stay right here. And of course, at 1 o'clock, do stay tuned for our lunchtime bulletin. Have a good afternoon.